I have three awesome panelists for today's webinar. We have our special guest, Aakash Gupta, who many of you may know is one of the leading PM voices out there, ex-VP of product and a seasoned product leader joining us today. And our very own Margaret-Ann and Vineeth, who are our product leaders here at Statsig. I'm going to have them all quickly introduce themselves before we get started. But what to expect today is we have a sort of 30-minute discussion on, what all of us have been seeing when it comes to building AI products and optimizing them. Um, Akash has done a lot of writing and content and research on these topics. And at Statsig, we've been seeing lately a lot of interest from our customers, and a lot of appetite for offline testing, online experimentation, and like an end-to-end workflow. So really excited to share all of that today. Um, you can keep your questions coming in through the webinar. You may use the Q&A option. I've also just enabled the chat so you can drop in questions either on the chat or on the Q&A option on Zoom. And we'll set some 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the talk to answer those questions as well. But yeah, without any further ado, Akash, do you want to give a quick intro and then we can have MA and Vineeth chime in as well?
Yeah, I started off my career as one of those PMs who was really just the advocate for experimentation. I remember at the second place I worked, I was like, can we please get Optimizely in at this company? They had no experimentation infrastructure. And from that moment on, I started to see the power of experimentation platforms. And so for the last couple years, I've been working with Statsig, learning from Statsig customers and interviewing a lot of product managers and different people out there about how they're doing experimentation. And in the age of AI, when there's so many buzzwords like evals, experimentation, so many different things that you need to focus on, we wanted to just get together today to help you guys better navigate the world of AI and experimentation. So really excited to chat with you today. Do you want to go next, MA?
Sure, I'll chime in. Hi, everyone. My name is Margaret-Ann. I go by MA, and I lead the product and design teams here at Statsig. And so very excited for today's conversation. We've been seeing a lot of activity in this space. And similar to Akash, my personal history is as a growth PM. And so there was a lot of experimentation and kind of data-driven bent to what I focused on. And so saw, and have been seeing at Statsig how that kind of has evolved from traditional experimentation into experimentation with models, with agents in kind of this new era. So I think it'll be a really cool discussion today. And I'll pass it to you, Vineeth.
Vineeth, product manager at Statsig, been here about 4 years. And I think part of what has been fascinating over the last couple of months is even though we've built an experimentation product, many of our customers are actually AI product builders. So companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, xAI. And many of them have been using us in slightly unusual ways. And part of what we've built around kind of better supporting AI tools has come from learning and watching these people do interesting things with the platform. And so excited to talk about some of that.
Yes, I can't wait to get into those details. Statsig is literally working with like the coolest companies in AI. And so that's what we're going to try to unpack for you guys today. But at the beginning, like, why is experimentation important in building AI products? You guys all know about experimentation because you're here. You guys are advanced experimenters. You're interested in Statsig, right? But I think what's interesting about AI products is that they fail differently than traditional software. I've seen tons of companies who they just launch some AI feature and they're burning through millions of dollars when they could have saved themselves through some proper experimentation. And why is that? Right? Number one is the black box problem, right? Unlike traditional features where you can predict outcomes, AI behavior is unpredictable. The second thing is there's a cost for getting AI wrong, right? AI mistakes are super expensive computationally and in user trust. So one bad experience, we saw this at Apollo.io, one bad email writer experience, boom, turns away users permanently. They just churn. And then there's the speed paradox, right? People think that AI is moving too fast for experimentation. Yesterday, Opus 4.1 came out. I don't have time to test out the new open source ChatGPT model as well. But I think it's actually the opposite, which is that AI's unpredictability makes controlled testing that much more essential. And so I wanted to get your guys' perspectives, MA and Vineeth. What are you guys seeing with teams? Why is experimentation so important in building AI products?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit on a number of the key points there, Akash. But like, if you zoom out and kind of step back for a second, theoretically, AI and kind of the widespread adoption of AI should be speeding up development. It should be enabling you to write more code, ship more features. It's kind of lowering the barrier of entry to building. But just because you can build and launch doesn't mean you should build and launch, right? And so I think what experimentation and just generally data-driven development can do is kind of provide that check on, hey, is the code going out the door actually good for customers? Is this new feature providing value? Are these things actually landing, or is this just velocity without actual impact, right? And so I think it's actually more important than ever when it's not you maybe personally crafting the feature that you're launching, but you're kind of relying a little bit more on an agent to do that. So I think that's the first point. The other thing is like, to your point about mistakes, I was recently listening to the Anthropic co-founder Benjamin Mann talk a little bit about like, I think it was contextual to the crazy $100 million Meta offers for these AI researchers. And the interviewer was like, is that actually happening? And like, why? Like, why would someone pay this kind of money? Which is a question on all of our minds, right? And his take was really interesting. He was like, actually, that's a bargain, right? Like the cost of messing up in the world of AI is just so high. If you could save 5% on, some sort of model optimization, that's actually potentially billions of dollars, right? And so these crazy sticker shock prices might actually seem like a bargain to the folks who are driving these companies, in terms of the value that these people provide. And so I think that's really important to hold in your head, which is like there's big upside to getting it right, but there's also big downside to getting it wrong. And experimentation and kind of knowing the impact of what you're launching prevents against that downside. So I think both of those are really important. I'm curious, Vineeth, what's your take on this? How are you seeing this importance kind of evolve to our customers?
The one thing I would add is like I often think about experimentation as one type of validation, and there's a bunch of validation that you can actually be doing. So like evals are some sort of things that you can be doing ahead of even launching stuff into production. And part of the reason why it's particularly interesting is just the rate of change. So earlier in my career, when we were waiting for phones to become larger or when we were waiting for better bandwidth to people, you were sometimes waiting for years. Whereas the rate of change with LLMs basically means that if there is something that is barely possible but doesn't quite work just now, you should probably begin to build it because if you have good evals, often the LLMs get so much better in 3 months or 6 months that what is barely possible is suddenly actually working really well. Like hallucinations was such a big problem, and we spent so little time worrying about it, and just being able to kind of benchmark and make sure that scenarios that kind of sort of work suddenly start working and being able to kind of track that is amazing.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's basically like if you are experimenting on something, you can take those risks, because you can quantify it and you don't have to worry that you're flying blind. So in a world where things are evolving really quick, you can kind of push the envelope and see what's possible with lower downside.
Yeah, people think it's expensive, but it's actually the cost of not doing it is often higher. So what is your guys' philosophy at Statsig towards building with AI?
Yeah, I'll tee up kind of our high level framework, and then I'd love to have Vineeth fill in with a bunch of the features that his teams have been building. So we kind of see it as three buckets. The first is table stakes for us. We need to power the AI companies that are leading this space, right? So we want to be working with the OpenAIs, the Anthropics, the XAIs, because we're learning from them. We're helping understand how the industry is evolving, and that's just kind of one of our keystones. The second bucket is how do we leverage AI to make our product better? So this is things like how do we, build a great MCP server integration so that Statsig is just accessible in Cursor or Claude Code from the command line, and you're just kind of seamlessly interacting with it and creating gates, logging events, just having everything happen behind the scenes. Or, how do we think about just aiding in your experimentation journey and making that easier with LLM support? So there's a whole bucket of work there. And then the third bucket, which we'll talk actually a lot about today, is enabling tooling to help teams build with AI. So we fundamentally believe that using models, using agents is going to be a core part of the just product development process. It's going to be in every product going forward. And so if we want to build the product development platform, that needs to be one of our pillars. And so that's things like evals or, online, offline evals, online experimentation, prompt experimentation, all that stuff. So those are kind of the three high-level buckets. Vineeth, I don't know if you want to provide some like really concrete examples of how each of those are playing out.
I'll maybe talk to one specific feature that we built out. So like one of the features that I'm actually very excited about is kind of this notion of a hypothesis advisor. And it's a little feature that's tucked away into Statsig, but it's essentially when people are setting up experiments, they can actually, capture a hypothesis so that other people have context on what they're trying to do, what their motivation is. And something that people that are trying to like up-level their experimentation programs care deeply is about making sure that that hypothesis is high quality. In the past, they would often do experiment reviews with people looking at it to kind of make sure that it met the bar. And what we built was a little feature where companies could tailor their guidance around what their expectations are around a good hypothesis are. And it's really kind of the training that you would give your experiment reviewers. And an LLM gives the person creating that experiment instant feedback on, what they might be missing, what they could do better. And it was kind of an interesting exercise as, like using the tools to actually build this feature because we kind of do two things. One is kind of give you critique, and the second is kind of help you reformulate your hypothesis into something that might be a little better. The first part of it was super easy to actually build and get right. And evals kind of allowed us to kind of do that at some scale. The second part, which is actually rewriting, was kind of like for me a learning experience on how hard it is to actually do things without having the LLM kind of go off the rails and still be kind of useful. And for me personally, like that was probably the first real world experience of kind of using evals in a real way to kind of tune and get something right. Because it's trivial to kind of do a demo for a feature like this in like literally 15 minutes, but it was probably a couple of weeks of kind of iterating on it to actually make it something that was high quality enough for production.
Fascinating. So with that feature, I'm curious, like, what were the different evals that you guys looked at, and how did you experiment before rolling it out?
So there were a bunch of evals. So some of the evals are kind of generic. So the generic evals tend to be things like, there is a tone that we're shooting for. There is expectations around conciseness and, brevity and like things like that. The more specific evals, the things that actually took us the hardest time to get right were around making sure the LLMs didn't make up stuff. So we wanted to be so when we ask the LLMs to reformulate things like maybe have a metric and or expect or describe expected gain, what we wanted it to do was kind of describe that, and if it was not present in the original content, provide placeholders so that people could replace that with the actual values. LLMs, on the other hand, loved to kind of make up stuff when you, instead of these placeholders, and actually describe, oh, you're going to get a 5% gain when really nobody has stated anything like that. And we don't want, people don't come to Statsig to have Statsig make up a number like that. And making sure that it was not making up stuff was probably some of the most challenging work we did around kind of the evals here.
And how did you phase the rollout and experiment with it?
Um, we typically, like many of our features, we phase rollouts with a few different intents. The initial percentage rollouts that we do, it's like to a small percentage, a single digit percentage of users. And really at that point, what we're looking for is the feature kind of working? Is anything broken? Is it going off the rails? And we look at that very closely. Once we're sure that that is not an issue, we kind of move to a slightly larger deployment. And with a slightly larger rollout, essentially, we're thinking about more experiment type things. So, are people discovering the feature? Are people engaging with it? Are they actually accepting the reformulations or are they rejecting it? And that looks like a more classic experiment where we're looking at, like, is this the right feature? Are we moving the metrics that we're thinking of? We had ended up having to do some rework to actually make sure that like initially the feature was like a little too subtle, People weren't discovering kind of, hey, you have this insight that we're willing to share with you. So we actually kind of did, iterated on it a little bit to make sure that people were actually discovering it without it being too intrusive in their workflow.
Love that case study. I think that that's exactly the thing that probably all the audience is facing right now. How do we actually roll this out? How do we actually experiment with it? This is one great example. And I think that we need to all be building these into our products, right? These AI agents, these little elements where we're baking AI into the cake. We're not just sprinkling it on top, but it's fundamentally, that's one of the key features of Statsig. It might just be a little feature that's tucked away, but it's adding a ton of value for the user. So where I want to shift to next is how is experimentation evolving in the age of AI? And I'll kind of present what I think of as like the three major things. So the first, Vineeth already gave us a concrete example, is offline evals are really your safety net these days, right? Evals are your AI's driving test. You wouldn't put someone on the road without it. And in the same case, right, you're not going to even start an experiment before that. And so what I found is that it's more important than ever for PMs, non-technical PMs, everyone to be building out these eval suites. To understand, for instance, did you know that LLMs are not very good at assigning 1 to 5 number ratings? And so in your evals, you shouldn't really be doing 1 to 5 number ratings, even though there are plenty of best practices you'll find out there that recommend that. Or did you know that LMs as judge can be really good, but it's very important for you to go through and do error analysis on that judge. So I think that building the eval skill set even prior to experimentation is one thing that's very, very interesting that's happening. The second is I think we're seeing a new testing reality where testing is really getting democratized, right? It's not just QA teams or PMs or engineers. There's content writers now evaluating your AI outputs. Your customer success team is testing the chatbot responses. So everyone is now an AI tester, I think. And then the third thing, of course, is what MCP servers have done, right? I think in the future, we can imagine like your AI agent automatically running experiments on the code it writes, right? There's all these things that we're now opening up for people. And so these are the three big trends I'm seeing. I'm curious, have you guys been seeing those and what else have you been seeing? Vineeth, do you want to go first?
Sure. We're definitely seeing all of those trends. The one additional trend that I'm seeing that is particularly interesting is kind of the notion of being able to do online evals. So offline evals are fantastic because when you have a ground truth data set or you have a data set that you're actually kind of want to iterate on very quickly, it's awesome to be able to do that. But sometimes the real world is different. And one of the things that our customers are wanting to do is actually, you have model X running in production, but now you have model X plus one and X plus two, and you want to kind of run them in shadow mode in production without the user actually seeing the output from them. And one of the things that, or one of the pieces of technology that actually unlocks this is, if you have a grader or LLM as a judge that can actually run at production scale, you can then be on real world data, be assessing silently, how does the output of model one, two, or three actually compare? Uh, and it, like the real world is always different, and being able to kind of use real data is super useful. One of the ways that customers actually use this is sometimes, we talk about LLM as a judge, and there are customers of ours that actually use humans as a judge. And you'll see AI companies actually doing this where you will literally see output from model A and model B presented side by side. And the user gets to select, "Hey, this one or this one." And, like it's kind of funny because I'm like, in general, we're seeing LLM as a judge, but there are cases where, you actually outsource this decision making back to a human, and being able to do that scale is incredible.
Speaking of that, I recently saw that Uber's offering that service, and I was like, "Wow, that's wild." But I get it, like, right? I used to be at Uber, and uh, back in the day, they would do data labeling for self-driving cars and customer support tickets and all this stuff by hand with humans. And now I guess they're offering some blended human and LLM powered data labeling service, which is kind of cool. Um, just to double click on kind of what Vineet's saying on the eval side, like, so you were saying kind of your second trend, Akash, was around democratization, and just like everyone is now kind of, an AI tester in a sense. We were having this conversation the other day where a bunch of the group is kind of former Facebook, and one of our engineers who was on Facebook search way back in the day, he was telling a story about how their kind of search ranking team was this like super senior, intimidating team of ML engineers. And, they were like the experts on ensuring that kind of the search algorithms were getting properly labeled data sets and training the models. And he did a rotation on that team, and he was expecting it to be, this crazy, intimidating concept. And it ended up just being a bunch of scripts that people were writing that were highly specialized, that like were essentially notebooks and scripts that these folks were experts on. No one else really knew or understood, and so this knowledge was super centralized in this group, right? But he was surprised at how kind of almost basic some of it was. And so I think it's funny because in my mind, I also used to think this was a very intimidating concept, right? Ooh, ML engineers, training models, da da da. But now I think like there's just so much appetite for everyone to be in that process. Everyone's writing prompts, everyone's refining prompts, everyone's engaging with models. And so we've been really, thinking about kind of the design challenge behind making evals approachable, right? We've had a couple design reviews where we're just going back and forth on like, how do we distill these concepts? How do we make them even simpler? If you don't have a background in, building ML models, how do we bring you in here and actually make this make sense? And it's a really good exercise because most of us don't have a background in that. And so we're thinking about if we were the users, how would we design this? And so to Vineeth and his team's credit, they've been building this evals product and they've been starting to show it to customers. And I think a couple customers have actually said, wow, this is really intuitive. Like even our PMs could use this, even, non-engineers could use this. And so I think that's one of the big trends is just if you're going to democratize these concepts, how do you build them really simply in an approachable, understandable way? It can't be some notebook in some, data scientist or ML engineer's head. It has to be a product that someone can pick up and use on day one and understand. So as a PM, like I love to nerd out over those design challenges, but I think that one in particular is pretty interesting.
Yes. What other interesting approaches are you guys seeing that teams are using to test their AI features? I can go first. So I'm seeing a lot of creativity. I think that there's a lot of stuff that wouldn't have worked for traditional software. So one example is this team that I talked to, they said they created a hallucination tournament. What is that? Right? They're running the same coding task through different models to track how confidently wrong each gets. Another one was doing like angry customer role plays. So this is actually a fintech company. So you can imagine like how important it is to avoid these. So what they did is they hired actors that are really like stress testing their AI support bot. And that really changed a lot of their escalation thresholds and when they're even deploying AI. Another one that I saw is AI shadow testing. So if let's say this is a healthcare company actually, back where I was in North Carolina. So what they were doing is they were working on AI diagnoses, right? So what they did is they started to run their AI diagnoses against old ones, but doctors only saw the old results. And that built them tons of stealth comparison data so that they could see like how doctors are performing with the old one versus the new one. And so the pattern is like the traditional metrics aren't exactly what we're using for AI. Teams are testing how an AI performs when a user is frustrated or unrelated questions or how often they make stuff up. So they're not really just measuring how it works, but they're actually measuring how it fails. And it feels like this error analysis component is really the most important one that AI is changing. Does that resonate?
Oh, error analysis is typically at the heart of like any kind of trying to make what you're trying to do with an LLM better. Um, Probably one of the more interesting things that I've noticed over the last couple of months is kind of just people kind of solving for themselves the bootstrapping problem. Because for people that already have production use cases with significant volumes, it's actually very easy to kind of create a data set to actually use for offline evals. But for people that are building new products, you often don't have a data set to actually start with. And it's kind of been fun to kind of see some of them use LLMs to actually create those seed data sets. Because if you have any kind of real world problem, if you're able to give the LLM enough context, the LLMs can actually generate things like, like the example that you used about here's angry customer data sets, here's people upset with these types of things. And being able to, even just construct synthetic data sets and look at what the failure modes on that are and what your error analysis for that tells you kind of helps shape your understanding of how to kind of make that thing before you actually hit contact with reality and real users.
Yeah, the synthetic data that these LLMs can generate is actually pretty good. Sometimes it's just even asking the LLM, like, what are some angry customer role plays we didn't hire customers to do in this scenario? And it's really good at generating some of those edge cases and then going off and testing against them. So you guys work with the most advanced experimentation teams in AI. Actually, we did a project earlier together this year where I went and talked to some of your customers, and these are some of the most interesting things that I saw, right? The average teams, they were maybe doing like 2 to 3 AI experiments per quarter, but these advanced teams like OpenAI, they're doing like 20 plus AI experiments monthly. It's like almost everything they ship is experimented on. It's not that they're just some things that they create an experiment for, they're creating that experimentation culture. And then they have these really cool AI specific stats, right? So for instance, they're doing automated stratification so power users don't all end up in one group, or they're doing AI batting averages. I think this is the batting average view at Statsig that I think is so powerful, right? So they'll say something like, oh, we ran 47 recommendation experiments. Only 23% of them improve click-through rate, and only 8% of them improve retention. They can have that view across experiments on a surface area within AI. And then there's advanced guardrails that people are developing, right? They're tracking hallucination rates, response times, cost per query. So what I'm seeing is that the most advanced teams are really taking experimentation up to the next level. And that's how they're shipping so fast. Like we always wonder, like, how is OpenAI shipping something almost every day? I think experimentation is actually the unlock for them. What else are you guys seeing these advanced experimentation teams do?
Well, I think one point on kind of your meta-analysis viewpoint, I think long term, these platforms, and this is how we think of it at Statsig, like you will get more value out of them the more you put in. So the more experiments you run, the more kind of meta-analysis across these experiments we can do, the more kind of trends we can pull out and say, hey, you may not want to experiment on this metric, it never moves, or hey, you may want to think about experimenting on this other surface. And so over time, like if you take this out to the extreme, you could almost think that we're building a product building model, per company, right? And so if you're running a lot of experiments, if you have a lot of data, if that data is well curated and just kind of like truly a canonical source of truth, this could provide incredibly good recommendations and help guide teams. But if you don't have that necessarily, you're not, running experiments or putting features behind feature gates and measuring the metric lift, you won't have that kind of feedback loop cycle to build good insights on top of. So I think like what we're seeing is the teams that do invest in this, they kind of have that long-term vision of how they're going to get a lot of value out of the platform from these meta-analyses, and they're actually pushing our meta-analysis roadmap. Versus the teams who are kind of on like ground zero, just starting to experiment or think about experimentation. It's all about running experiments and not the long-term kind of feedback mechanism that those produce.
The one interesting thing with a lot of these advanced experimenters is also kind of this notion of building towards a pit of success. Like everyone that does a lot of experiments worries about the wrong ways to do experiments and making sure people don't get trapped in those. And what they're trying to push into the tools is making sure that anyone that joins the company is actually successful with running a good experiment without having to think about it, without having to spend a lot of time on it. And yeah, just making sure that every experiment is actually a good experiment by default is something that they're kind of pushing the tools towards.
And I think today's solves for that are pretty basic, right? It's like permissions and role-based access controls and guardrails, right? But you can imagine in the future, you don't need to micro-configure what individual roles can and can't do. It's more there's some kind of guiding force, whether that's an LLM or just smart kind of AI-driven features like the hypothesis advisor that just nudge people in the right direction. And it's really hard to do something wrong. So you kind of fall into that pit of success, to use your term, Vineeth.
100%. I think that the changes of AI in experimentation, we could go on for hours, but I think that's the high level. These are the main trends that we're seeing. I think at this point, Sid, correct me if I'm wrong, we want to open it up to you guys. What are you guys seeing in experimentation? What questions do you guys have?
Yeah, totally. I think we had a few questions come through during registration, so maybe we can start, by taking a couple of those while I encourage folks to use the Q&A or the chat to drop any questions that you have, whether you want to learn more about what Statsig's building or just more broadly on trends that our panelists have been seeing. Feel free to drop those questions and we can double click on those. But I had this one question come through from Jason, who is the head of product growth at Applica. And Jason's question is, I work in the mobile app growth, mostly in the B2C space. How do you determine if an AI feature is the right fit for your product? So might be getting, I guess, more to the online experimentation side that was touched upon towards the end. But do you want to, maybe Aakash, do you want to touch on that? And then we can have MA and Vineeth chime in as well.
So how do you know if you should bring AI into your feature, right? I think that the first thing is that we don't want to bring AI into every problem. I think there was an era about a year ago where investors and boards were saying, okay, you just need to ship lots of AI features. And we all saw what that did, right? People shoved AI into every random workflow, but it actually hurt the engagement and retention of our products. And I believe this person said he was in consumer. So in consumer, especially, like people aren't just using your product, whatever Applica does, because it has AI. They're using it to solve your given problem. And I love the example Vineeth gave of the hypothesis advisor, right? The job to be done of the experimentation platform is to make sure that people are setting up great hypotheses. And we can see that without AI, it would be very hard to give people good advice. You'd just be able to give them very generic advice. So AI is actually a very important unlock in that feature. It is providing you a capability that you couldn't have before. So it actually makes sense to bring AI into that. And it's a core job to be done of the user. So what are the things, right? Always go for the simplest solution. Don't put AI in if you don't have to. Make sure it's a core job to be done. And then the final end, what we've just been spending the last 30 minutes on, make sure that through evals and experimentation, AI is providing a reasonable response. It is not hallucinating too much, and it is increasing trust in what your users are doing. And so the big mistake, I think, is people will vibe code some AI solution. These days, you can just use Lovable or Bolt to do that in 30 seconds and they'll start to ship it out. But I think having this careful approach of offline, online evals and experimentation before you roll it out and even phasing that rollout is super, super important. We made that same mistake at Apollo.io multiple times where we're just shoving AI into different parts of the product, but the best ones, the ones that are still there that they haven't removed a year later, were done in this very controlled way.
I have a fun story to share that's kind of almost the anti-pattern of what not to do. Many years ago, Outlook decided AI was really cool, or ML was really cool back in the day. And they decided to train for each individual that used Outlook a model that classified this is an email you want to look at, and this is an email you may not want to look at. So think of it, it's sort of like Gmail's priority inbox. And they actually trained this model for each person. It was one of the most expensive compute projects they'd ever taken on. At some point of time, they bought this company called Acompli, which became now what is Outlook Mobile on iOS. And they had exactly the same feature, and it was 80 case statements. It was literally if this, if this, if this, if this, it's probably an email you want to see. And what's funny is the Accompli model actually did better than this per person trained model. And today, of course, if you're doing something like this, an LLM-based thing might do it very simply, but it's kind of a good example of like focus on the problem and make sure you're doing the cheapest thing possible to actually deliver a great experience.
To that point on the cheapest thing, I think that's actually a really important tidbit there. Like, one thing that you may want to consider is a painted door test, right? So just seeing like if anyone even engages with this thing before you go invest a lot in building, training a model, running evals, experimenting. Like literally, does anyone want to click on this and find value? You can do something really cheaply. My favorite version of this is Vineeth recently launched a product on LinkedIn that wasn't built. And he put out the launch video basically to gauge whether customers would be excited about it. And this would provide value to customers. And there was a ton of engagement. And Vineeth was like, great, we're going to go build it. So I just can't, overemphasize how important the find a way to cheaply validate is, because compute is expensive, training models is expensive, evaluating models is expensive. Figure out first that it's going to actually drive value for customers.
That's very cool. Vineeth may or may not have asked me to help with that video.
Sid, you're an accomplice.
I see another really cool question from Nikhil Goyal, who's a PM. This may, I mean, obviously we've talked a lot about like, the offline evals and the testing workflows. But maybe this is, as PMs, how do you put boundaries between human touch and AI generated output? That's Nikhil's question. Maybe you can also just touch upon like, where you think, where you see your own roles as like product leaders, like changing when, you have more AI generated output, when you still want to bring in your human element and context. I think that's what the question is getting to. I know, Aakash, you've done a ton of content on this. So maybe, again, do you want to go first and then we can have our product leaders also chime in?
Yeah, I wish he was here just to make sure I truly understood the nature of his question so that I could give him a more specific answer. But at the high level, right? And if he is, feel free to just drop your comments in the chat so that we can really address it specifically. But I think the way I understand the question is like, AI is generating different output, whether it might be what experiment we should run, what the results of the experiment are, how you should configure the experiment. These days, even AI can help you build the experiment. So across ideate, build, configure, analyze, AI is giving you output in your experimentation. What's the line between relying on the AI too much, using your human sense? And I think that the big problem with a lot of the AI today is that it's still difficult to load it up with all of the context we as a product manager have downloaded. The customer discovery calls that we're doing every week, the conversations and insights we're getting from our customer success and go-to-market teams about what we're hearing from people who spend all their time with customers, the prior experiments that we ran, that's one thing that the experimentation platforms these days, they are actually loading up better context, maybe even than the human brain, because you might actually find that you can get that context from experiments being run by a different PM in a different service. And so it's almost about recognizing what context the AI I have does and doesn't have. And if it's really got more context on the experiments that we ran, then my role as a human is to really think about what the context it doesn't from all those conversations internally and externally and add that in. And so what I like to do is use AI more as a thought partner and less as a first draft. I think when you use it as a first draft, it almost becomes like a crutch. Like if you're using that to, let's say, choose the North Star metric for your experiment, it might come up with an idea, but it's actually better for you to think about it from first principles and then use it as a thought partner to validate that. Ask it, hey, what do you think about this North Star metric? What are some other alternatives? What might be some blind sides I didn't think about? And use it as that thought partner to improve it. So I like to say, like, you do the first 20% of thinking, AI helps you get from 20 to 80%. And then the last 20% of thinking you might do as well. And especially for that last 20%, bring in your data scientist, bring in your other people on your team who can sanity check it, bring in your product leadership. And so That to me is the right life cycle for working with AI um, in experimentation.
The one thing that resonated around kind of using it as a thought partner is one of the things I've realized is AI actually sometimes helps me think more clearly about things. So a good example of this is, we were talking about the hypothesis advisor, and part of kind of building that out was actually deconstructing the rubric I have in my head for what is a good hypothesis. I have sometimes explained that to other people, but what I don't get back is feedback from them around them then trying to use the knowledge I've shared with them and see, you got this wrong, or I didn't explain this well. And the really cool thing about like working with an AI product around, you like trying to give it the rubric that I use, if you can actually see it, try to use that rubric and then realize, I didn't express that clearly enough, or I didn't capture this one thing that I automatically looked for. And, you know, just kind of building out that process of capturing that well, I feel like forces me to be, like think more clearly and have a better rubric to share with someone else as a human the next time I'm trying to do that.
Yeah, almost sharing like frameworks or telling the AI, right? Like, this is the rubric I use, or act as an experimentation expert. I think all those things are really good hacks to make sure that you get the right output out of the AI.
MA, anything you want to add there? Or I think the next question might be a good one for you as well, but I just want to give you a chance if you wanted to add something there.
No, I think everyone covered it. I've got some personal anecdotes about using now Grok in my Tesla as a therapist X thought partner, but we'll save those for another day.
Maybe we'll finish with some hot takes before we conclude. But I see an interesting question that's just come up on the Q&A. And maybe this is something, Emmy, you can touch upon, given your experience at like Uber in the past. So the question is anonymous, and I can maybe see why, because like you don't want to talk openly about like wanting to monetize your products, I guess. But the question from our attendee is like, with so many experiments being run and teams shipping faster than ever, what's the mental model PMs use when deciding how or whether to monetize new products? And what are common challenges you see teams face with making that decision?
Yeah, this is very topical. Even just now at Statsig. Good example is we build a platform, right? And so our platform has multiple product SKUs. I think we're best known in the market for experimentation, but we also have kind of feature flagging, product analytics, session replay, all these different products that are part of the core product building experience. And we've struggled with each one to figure out, when is that switchover point from exposing the product, letting people use it for free, give feedback, make it better, drive adoption, make sure we have product market fit. And then how do we then monetize it, right? Because you've been giving this feature to free for everyone. What's the gate at which point you then ask them to pay? And so one meta thing I've thought a lot about is you almost, and this comes back to Vineeth's pit of success phrase, you almost want to build a pricing strategy where people just fall into paying for a product if it provides them value, right? And so what's really tough is, for example, having to ask someone to, at contract time, and this is going to be a B2B example, but I'll use B2B to start. At contract time, sign, for 3 different line items for different products. They haven't had a ton of time to try them. They don't know if they're going to provide value. You're kind of asking them to commit to something that is somewhat unknown. Versus, let's say you had a pricing strategy where it's like a commit-based model and each product line has some sort of drawdown meter, but you just automatically are drawing down on that commit as you start using the product, right? Then it's all about value. It's like, does this product provide value? If it provides value, people will use it and then they're automatically paying for it. And so that's kind of the pit of success that you fall into. And so what I would say is, ultimately you can only monetize something that provides value. But you can also only monetize it if you have a pricing strategy that makes it easy for people to pay for it and kind of automatic, because they're going to be used to using it for free in the beginning and kind of in some limited capacity. So how do you make that switchover point really, really easy and set yourself up for success long term? But yeah, my general framework is, first job to be done is provide value to your customer. If you can provide value and there's product market fit, then you earn the right to monetize it. And at that point, you should try to think, ahead to how do you set yourself up to just make that automatic, essentially. I don't know, Akash, you've looked across a ton of different products and a ton of different pricing strategies, and I'm sure even like interviewed pricing experts. So what are some of the trends that you've seen?
So I think AI has accelerated the trend toward buyer-friendly pricing, where, people were so used to just having a per seat model essentially, maybe with like ABCD plans, right? And you just drop in your better features on C and D. But with AI, what we're seeing is much more clever pricing strategies. Some companies, whether it's like Lindy AI, which is like an AI agent builder, or Zapier, another like no code tool to put together these AI, they're charging you based on how much AI you're using. So it's very much like usage based pricing. Or if you look at the other end of the spectrum, like an intercom, they're charging you based on the outcomes that AI is actually driving, like the amount of deflections that AI is creating from you having to talk to a customer service rep. Because if you talk to a customer service rep, it's like minimum like $10 to $15 just based on the minimum wage that you're paying, the wage you're paying that person times the hours. And so people are shifting towards usage, outcome-based pricing. They're moving away from the per seat, per plan model. And like you said, though, there's a lot of things that you want to do to make sure that people actually adopt these things. And so giving a little free taste, giving elements of building it into the product, and having some sort of usage paywall is really, really common these days, or some sort of usage gate, I think. Overall, though, the AI monetization, I think this person was asking, like, what's the mental model PMs use when deciding? And I think what a PM is trying to do is they're trying to look at what is the business impact? Is this going to be good for our business? And since AI features are so expensive, the very first thing PMs are going to say is we can't give away too much of this for free. It's going to cost us money. And so PMs are always going to be thinking about, well, how can I monetize this? How should I monetize this? And so the most common challenge teams are facing is how do I get adoption for this AI feature because it costs me money. I can't just give it away for free. And so that I think is where usage or outcome-based pricing ends up coming in.
Nice. Maybe we can take one final question before we wrap up. And I think I like this question that came through from Ario, who's a founder. And Ario's question is on, for vibe coders who want to use Statsig or an experimentation tool, do you have any, I think the question just says like best practices for vibe coders, but I know we touched upon a bit on the Statsig MCP server and like, workflows with Cursor. But Akash, maybe do you want to touch on just like, how vibe coding, what you're seeing there with like, maybe more PMs and founders getting involved with like that building process. And then, MA and Vineeth, maybe you can touch upon like how Statsig is sort of fitting into those workflows with Lovable, Cursor, etc.
Yeah, I've seen this huge rise in vibe experimentation because the intersection of vibe coding and experimentation is like magic for anybody now. Even like somebody was just telling me that one of their product partnerships guys vibe coded an idea of brand new copy for their partnerships landing page. So what did the PM do? He just sent it over to design and engineering review to make sure that it's fitting their design systems, engineering that they can actually ship it, it'll scale, it'll work with their backend. And after they made some small tweaks to the vibe coded prototype by this product partnerships person, they just set it live in an experiment. It's like vibe experimenting is allowing a lot more people to experiment. And so I think as a founder who's vibe coding, you should think about experimentation as enabling you to even work faster because it's going to allow you to just quickly try something, go through a quick check on design and engineering, and then launch it. And so, what I would say is experimentation is almost your unlock for your vibe coding because you don't want to just launch all these things to everybody. Now, you might be a solo founder, you might be operating like a smaller thing. And so, your question might be, do we have the right volume? And that is always the concern. Sometimes what I say is like, look at the conversions, right? Because it's not just the visitors that matter. It's like your end result that's going to determine how much volume you really need for statistical significance. And so see if you have enough conversions happening in that space. And a lot of times we might vibe code an experiment like changing the ghost text in a search bar or changing the text on a CTA button. In that case, there might actually be enough conversions to experiment. So it might be possible faster than you think. And using some of the advanced experimentation techniques, whether it's, bandits or different things like that, you might be able to still experiment even as a solo founder.
So couple things here. One, Sid did call out our MCP integration, which I think is an important unlock if you want to use something like Cursor or Cloud Code in tandem with Statsig. And we're working on kind of what that version looks like for Lovable right now. The second thing is we've been experimenting with kind of low code, no code tooling to set up experiments. So we have this Chrome extension called Statsig Sidecar that kind of lets you configure experiments on your landing page with a point and click type UX. And so that in tandem with a vibe coded site where, you can point and click and set up an experiment on an element, maybe log certain events, create dashboards from those events based on those elements. You pair that with like auto capture of, typical web-based events, and you actually have something pretty powerful. So this is something that we're thinking a lot about recently because part of our mission is not just to enable the most advanced experimentation, but also broaden the reach and kind of democratize who can experiment. And this is a big part of it.
Sounds great. Akash, anything you wanted to add there? Or
I would
Vineeth?
say as a founder, vibe coding, just keep going. And if you're running into that traffic issue, then what you should probably do is think about how you can use evals or some of these other products that Statsig is developing and some of the synthetic data that Vineeth was talking about also to test your system. There are so many new hacks in the AI world to simulate some of these results, but it's still important to have that experimental mindset about figuring out whether this actually works instead of just vibe coding and then releasing to production.
Sounds great. Um, All right, I guess we are at time. And thank you so much everyone for joining us today. I do want to, thank Akash, our special guest, for joining us, and MA and Vineeth as well for joining us this morning. Before we conclude, just wanted to, let folks know that we'll be sharing the recording after the webinar in a couple of days. We also have some great resources on our blogs that you can check out. We've been publishing a lot of content around this space. Follow us on LinkedIn. We talk a lot about our latest feature launches, including some of the work we are doing in the AI eval space. And before we go, just want to ask our panelists if you have any final concluding thoughts or any hot takes that you want to share off the record. I promise I can make sure that this isn't in the recording, but just curious, if you have any final thoughts on just for people who are exploring the space, because things are happening so fast, and I think we're also figuring things out in real time, it feels like, and it's all happening right now. So yeah, just what you're most excited about, or any I'd love a hot take, but what maybe you're most excited about in the space.
Oh gosh, I'm curious what your hot takes are.
I
Given
mean,
you
if
see across all these companies.
yeah, well, especially if you look at the most successful AI companies, right? If they're running almost everything as an experiment, why can't you? And when I go talk to the normal companies, they'll come up with thousands of reasons why, right? Oh, we had a big marketing moment tied to the launch, or oh, we don't have the infrastructure in place, or the executive wanted it out by this amount of time. But I think it's try to use some of the proof points we've shared with you here. The OpenAIs, the XAIs, the Anthropics of the world, the companies who are leading this revolution, they're really experimenting with everything. And that should be the bar for you as well.
Yeah, I think one of the hot takes on that is actually that probably the reason they're experimenting is because they don't know how something's going to perform. There's a lot of uncertainty, right? And you brought up the point very early in the webinar that like these models are fundamentally non-deterministic, right? And you don't know necessarily what's going to happen, and hallucinations are a thing. And you know, it's actually a good sign that we're testing everything in this new world. And I think that means that it's not just like a nice to have, it's a need to have for all companies. If these big model companies view it as necessary, to your point, I think it is really necessary.
No hot takes from Vineeth, I guess. Uh, but you can follow Vineeth on LinkedIn. Like there are a lot of hot takes um, over there. So, all right. With that said and done, thank you all so much for joining us. Hope to see you again soon at one of our webinars. Thanks once again to our panelists, and bye for now.